Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I'm very excited today to be able to share with you a review of the RME ADI-2 DAC. The reason I'm so excited is because I've been asked about this DAC so many times in comments, and as always when people do ask about certain products, I try where possible to get my hands on those products and provide some of the comparisons that people are asking for. Before I start talking about the product itself, I want to say a huge thank you to the Australian distributor, and that's Innovative Music Australia. Thank you to Ben and the team over there for making the review possible and providing this loan unit to me for a really quick turnaround. There's another reviewer waiting on it, so I really appreciate Ben arranging to squeeze me in before it heads up to Sydney for the review there. And just going further off topic for a second, don't forget about the Moondrop SSR IEM giveaway. If you're keen to win yourself a pair of those IEMs, all you have to do to win those IEMs is be a subscriber and drop a comment down below. It's that simple. Now back to the ADI-2. One of the reasons this review has been requested so much is that the RME ADI-2 is really a direct competitor for the Chord Q-Test DAC that I reviewed some time ago. Now I'm a huge fan of the Q-Test, and as a full disclaimer, I just want to say up front, having spoken to Rob Watts in detail in the interview that I did on this channel, I am a little bit biased towards Chord's approach to sound. So I just want to start off with that because I was going into this expecting to like the Q-Test slightly more, or maybe a lot more, than the ADI-2. Without giving too much away, what I'm going to say is that having lived with both of them now for a week and a bit, and having them side by side, playing all sorts of different music, what I can tell you is that I do still prefer the Q-Test, but only in certain situations, and that's going to be really the key of this review. The ADI-2 is an outstanding product. I'm about to talk about why, and I'll do a separate video which is a 100% comparison between the Q-Test and the ADI-2. I will make mention again of the Q-Test in this video, but I'll go into much more depth separately so as not to bog this one down with too much comparison. As always, before we get into the sound, let's start talking about some of the design, features and functionalities. So the ADI-2 is quite a compact little unit. It's nothing too dramatic. I was expecting it to be a bit bigger if I'm honest, but I like the fact that it's smaller. It's going to fit pretty easily on most desks, and as an all-in-one unit, that's a really good thing. You could have just this on your desk and a computer, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, and you've got yourself a full, really good quality headphone system ready to go. But the ADI-2 is also more than that. Let's talk about what it's got going for it. First on the front here, we've got a 6.3mm output. Obviously, sorry, I should say there's a power button there. You need one of those. You've got a 6.3mm headphone output. You've got a 3.5mm IEM output, so dedicated for IEMs, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. You've got a volume control, which also serves as a mute button. And then you've got buttons here for things like the volume details, the in-out, the EQ and general setup. The one thing I'm going to talk about shortly is that I find the use of these buttons a little bit clumsy, but also really powerful. So we'll get into that in a second, but these are the buttons I'm going to be talking about when I talk about the menu system. To control everything, we've also got these two dials over here. Now each of these dials is both a push button, but it's also a rotary dial as well. And you've got number 1 and number 2 that both interact with the menus, or if you're not in a menu, are your bass and treble controls. Now I'm not a huge fan of things like bass and treble controls or EQs. I don't like to mess with the signal if I can avoid it, but it's nice for those that want it, that at the quick turn of a dial, you've got treble and bass right in front of you. If you want more control, there's the EQ button that takes you into a very powerful and fully featured parametric equalizer. While we're talking about what's on the device, let's turn it around and have a look at the back. On the back here, we've got a power input. Now that power input actually has a locking mechanism, which I really like. So you push the plug in and you turn it slightly and that locks it in place, saves it from dropping out, which sometimes it can be an issue with some of the DC style plugs. There's nothing really holding them in place. So it's a nice little additional feature. It's not hugely necessary, but I thought I'd mention it. We've got a USB-B socket here, a coaxial input, an optical input. You've got balanced left and right out, and you've got RCA single-ended left and right out as well. So this DAC does provide a fully balanced output, as well as of course your single-ended output. It's also got all 3 major types of digital input, so it's very flexible and able to do pretty much anything you're going to ask of it. And that's where the magic of the ADI-2 starts to come in. And as I said before, one of the reasons why I do think it's a really good piece of competition for the Q test because of its versatility and flexibility. The ADI-2 retails for about $2,200 here in Australia, which is around about the $1,500 to $1,600 US mark. So it puts it just below the Chord Q test, which here in Australia is $2,400. So looking about $200 less for the ADI-2 in order to get all these extra features and functions with a slight trade-off on sound quality, just to give you a bit of a teaser of what's coming. What that $2,200 is getting you is an extremely powerful DAC that is so much more than a traditional DAC. It gives you control over the sound that's really unheard of, and a lot of that comes from the fact that what I've got here, which is the ADI-2 DAC FS, is essentially a consumer version of their Pro DAC. So the ADI-2 Pro has been adjusted and modified to make the ADI-2 FS. So what they've done to make this a consumer version is they've stripped out balance drive for the headphones and replaced it with the IEM socket here. They've also removed the ability for it to act as an analog to digital converter, so for recording purposes, in order to focus it entirely on producing audio from a computer or other digital source into your headphones or speakers. So it's very much focused on consumers, and as a result, based on measurements I've seen around the internet, it actually performs better than the Pro as well. So for any of you looking out there thinking, should I be getting the Pro because it's called a Pro, unless you're looking to do recording with it, I really don't see any point. This is the better performing product and the more versatile product for consumer headphone and speaker use. What this consumer version ADI-2 has inherited from the Pro version though is the insane amount of control that you get over the music. Now I mentioned earlier these buttons down here. One of the drawbacks of the ADI-2 is it can do so much that the menus are really clumsy at first. It takes quite a while to get used to navigating them and understanding what the different shortcuts mean and where to find the setting that you're looking for. Once you get used to it, it's not so bad, and I actually found myself really enjoying having the power and control over the way the unit was working, so I could set it up just right for my needs. That's something that a lot of other DACs don't do. Definitely the Chord Q test doesn't do it. The sorts of things that I'm talking about here is the ability to have each individual output, that being the line out through the back, the headphone jack and the IEM jack, all set up slightly differently. So for example, you could go in there and you could change the filter that you use to send out to your speakers or your separate headphone amplifier compared to the filter that you might use for your headphones running off the ADI-2 directly compared to the filter that you use for the IEMs. So there's lots of things you can tweak to adjust the way the amplifier works with different sources and different outputs. And I think that's a really valuable thing. If you've got specific setups where you want to tailor the sound to suit what you're listening to from that setup, it's a really helpful feature to have. Likewise, the ability to have a parametric equalizer at your fingertips means that you're going to be able to tweak the sound in a high quality format, handled by a great piece of equipment that's been engineered specifically to do it, and you don't have to risk messing around with EQs in potentially crude software that might be damaging the signal integrity in the process. Now, for those not familiar with parametric equalizers, there are graphic equalizers and there are parametric equalizers. Graphic equalizers are your fixed band equalizers that have multiple channels at each frequency, where you might have, say, 100 Hertz and you can increase that by a number of decibels, and then you might have 150 Hertz and 250 Hertz and so on and so forth. That's a graphic equalizer. Each of those frequency levels is fixed. With a parametric equalizer, what it allows you to do is decide which frequency you want to center your increase or decrease on and how widely you want that curve to affect. So you could have a really tight point where you just want to bump up, say, I'm just making up numbers here, 100 Hertz. Or you might say, you know what, I want a more general bass boost. You can, instead of having a tight peak, you can change what they call the Q and open that up to a wider band. And therefore, when you're boosting at 100, it might be lifting 120 and 80 a little bit at the same time. So it gives you lots of control to tweak the sound and pull out little spikes that you might have in your equipment or in your room setup if you're using speakers, or similarly boost something if there's a bit of a flat spot in your system. So the long and the short of it is that the ADI-2 is incredibly powerful. It's very daunting when you first get to start using it, but after a little bit of time and getting familiar, it's a very, very powerful and convenient unit to use. All of the navigation is handled through these two knobs here on the side. So once you press the button to go into the section that you want to go into, you can use the 1 dial or the 2 dial to rotate, which is often the adjustment itself, or to click up or down to move up and down through the actual menu system. So it's pretty simple once you get used to it. The hardest thing was to remember where to find the settings that I was looking for. Again, it was something I got used to, but the first few times I went to try and play with the filters, I immediately went to setup thinking that's where I'd find it. Now the setup menu controls things like the color of the display, whether it's a dark or a light theme for the display. It's very much the system setup. It's not about the sound setup. Where things like filters sit and things like crossfeed, which I'll talk about in a second, is within the in-out menu, because as I touched on before, you can set up those things differently depending on the source you're driving. Now let's talk about crossfeed, as I just mentioned. Crossfeed is a function that takes parts of the frequency from each channel and shares it across the channels. What it's doing is it's going to allow you to get more of an effect of listening to speakers when you're listening to headphones. And this is where the magic of having separated in and outputs comes into play. If you're using speakers, you probably don't need crossfeed because you've already got the natural crossfeed of being able to hear the left speaker through into your right ear and the right speaker into your left ear. However, if you're listening to headphones from one of these two jacks on the front, you may want to apply the crossfeed, and you may want to apply it differently for IEMs where you've got a full seal compared to open headphones where you're going to get a bit of leakage getting to each ear. So you see straight away we get the benefit of adjusting each output based on what we're using it with. I like the fact that crossfeed is also available on the outputs because for me, if I'm running this to a separate headphone amplifier, I may still want to use crossfeed on that. Also on the in-out menu, you've got the ability to change the width of the stereo image by essentially adjusting it from stereo all the way down to mono. Or you can actually flick a switch and just go straight to mono and not have that scale or that continuum to work with. There's lots of different setups, lots of power, lots of control, and that to me is really the selling point of the ADI-2.
Drunk, I've never seen you clearer than now. We're flying high, floating somewhere up in the clouds. We're going out of ourselves, can you feel it? Almost like I don't know if it's real, cause when we're doing our thing, we're like wheels that won't stop turning. So take me on a trip, 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 now, trip, trip, trip. Oh, flick that switch, kill the lights. Oh, wasted. City lights are shining.
Something else that I absolutely love about this unit is that when you connect a headphone to the unit when it's already running, let's say you've been driving speakers with it through an amplifier and you want to plug in your earphones, whether they're IEMs or headphones, what the system will do is it will actually gently fade in the sound. And that's a really nice touch. Again, it's not one of those things that's a game breaker if it wasn't there, but I really appreciated it just easing that music into my ears, particularly with something like the IEMs, where it's in your ear and any high sound pressure level change can be quite a shock to the system. The other thing that I really loved about this is just its versatility. The ability to switch between different inputs, different outputs, different settings depending on those inputs and outputs, and the fact that I could go from listening to an external headphone amplifier to a high quality built-in headphone amplifier that was suitable for high powered cans like the Focal Clears or the Mezzo Empyreans or IEMs was really, really valuable to me. And that's where this for me really takes the cake, is its ability to do absolutely everything and do it very well. I'm not going to say it does it perfectly, and I'll get to that in a second, but it does it extremely well. And as an all-in-one unit, it's something that I would absolutely jump at owning if I was in need of something like this. So having spoken about the features and the functions and all the versatility, let's talk now about the DAC stage itself. I will talk about the amplifier in a second, but I want to start talking about the DAC. Now, before I talk specifically about the ADI-2, I just want to talk about something that I've noticed around the forums. Whenever I've looked up the ADI-2 versus the Q-test comparison, because it's often a comparison made, I've noticed that some people swear by the fact that the ADI-2 is the better sounding unit, others will swear by the fact that the Q-test is the better sounding unit. And that's where a lot of this hobby comes down to our own personal perceptions, our own personal preferences, and so what I'm about to say is not meant to necessarily say that I am right and anyone else is wrong. However, I do want to point out where I'm coming from with this so as to make it clear why I think the Q-test DAC sounds better than the ADI-2 DAC by a very small margin. On paper, the ADI-2 and the Q-test measure very, very similarly. They're very, very clean DACs, very, very low distortion levels, and therefore should be producing a very similar sound on paper. However, a measurement of a DAC is not everything to do with its sound. Don't forget what a DAC's doing. A DAC is taking digital data from your computer, from a CD player, whatever the transport is that you're using, and it is reconstructing that digital data into an analog signal. So part of the challenge in that, and those of you that have watched my interview with Rob Watts will have seen the conversation about this, part of the challenge of that is that when people are measuring DACs, they're generally measuring static signals. So a sine wave, for instance, at a particular frequency like 1 kilohertz or 500 hertz. And that's very different to music. Music is constantly changing. Think about the last piece of music you listened to and how many individual instruments were in that piece of music. Unless you were listening to a solo singer a cappella or a soloist piano or something similar, you're likely to have been listening to music that had many elements going on. Maybe a vocalist, a drum kit, which in itself is many instruments. You've got cymbals, you've got hi-hats, you've got snares, you've got the tom-toms, you've got a kick bass, then you've got a bass guitar, an electric guitar, you might have keyboards, synthesizers. There's so much going on, and every single one of those sounds is interacting with each other. So if you've ever seen the waveform of recorded music, it doesn't look like a sine wave. It looks like a whole lot of jaggedy edges and peaks and troughs, and it's very, very unpredictable. And that's where the magic of DACs comes into play. As I talked about with Rob Watts, the challenge for a DAC is not just recreating a 20 kilohertz sine wave or up to a 20 kilohertz sine wave. It's about the things that happen faster than 20,000 times a second. And that's the textural or timbral cues within the music itself. And that to me is where the Q-test gets a slight edge over the DAC in the ADI-2. Now before anyone thinks that I'm saying this DAC is not fantastic, that's not my point. It is an absolutely brilliant DAC, and if this was my only DAC, I would be very, very happy with it and never complain once. It's extremely detailed, it's extremely clear. What holds it back ever so slightly for me is a very, very slight sense of etched treble. And when I say etched, I mean it's just a tiny bit harsh, it's a tiny bit forced, and that's what I tend to hear from most DACs that are not the chord DACs, or in fact, the multi-bit DACs from shit I find don't do that either. So it's interesting. It's obviously something to do with the way the signal's being reconstructed as to how that treble information is coming across, and indeed some of the textural cues through the mid-range as well. I think it's that exact same etchedness, as I'm calling it, that is why some people actually think the ADI-2, and I don't mean think in a negative way, it's why some people perceive the ADI-2 and prefer the ADI-2 as being more detailed and maybe clearer and with a bit more air than something like a Q-test. Definitely when you listen to the Q-test next to it, the Q-test does come across smoother, whereas this does come across a bit drier, and there for some people it's going to sound like it is giving you more detail. As I said, I'll go into much more detail about a comparison between the two in a whole separate video that's literally a direct comparison of the two, point for point. But for now, what I wanted to say about the DAC on the ADI-2 is it's extremely detailed, extremely resolving, very clean sounding, and overall outstanding. It's just not the best in class as a pure DAC. What sets it apart though is all of those features and functions and controls that go along with the DAC. Now I should also point out at this stage that I tried both the RCA single-ended outputs and the balanced outputs from the DAC, and I do believe that the balanced output is slightly better sounding, and when I say better, it's a bit cleaner, it's a bit crisper, and therefore a slightly better sense of resolution. What I can't separate is that I don't have identical interconnects because RCA and XLR are different. I can't say that it's not the interconnects playing a little bit of that role, but I do believe that the balanced output from the ADI-2 is slightly superior to the RCA outputs. Just to be clear, in my comparisons with the Q-test that I've been referring to, I used the balanced outputs from this, and I used obviously the single-ended because it's all it's got from the Q-test. Let's talk now about the amplifier stage, because that's one of the things that really separates this from a competitor like the Q-test, and what makes this such a great option as a standalone, all-in-one do-everything unit. Obviously, if the amplifier built in is not up to task, then it's going to let the overall system down for that major selling point that it has. Being an all-in-one, I always expect the amplification to be not the best possible option on the market, but I was certainly hoping with the ADI-2 that it was going to stack up well to some really solid competition. And what I found it was really similar to something like the Massdrop THX 789 amplifier, which I've reviewed here on this channel. It's very popular around the traps, and I have to say it's a really good amplifier. It's not end game, it's not top of the heap, but it's extremely good, and therefore for a built-in unit like this to be on the same sort of level as the 789 is fantastic, and it's exactly what you want from a unit like this. It's never going to leave you wanting or feeling like it's holding the system back, but at the same time you can always upgrade from it by using the XLR or the RCA outputs to feed a separate headphone amplifier should you wish. Now, I've already mentioned the fantastic fading function when you plug in 6.3 or 3.5mm plugs. I should also mention that the two outputs are also different. Unlike something like the 789 where it's the same output just wired to different plugs, in the case of the ADI-2, the 6.3mm jack will output a maximum of 1.5 watts, whereas the 3.5 has been limited to only 40 milliwatts. Now that may sound like not very much, but when you're talking about highly sensitive IEMs, it's plenty of power, and you don't want too much, because if you've been listening to this thing at volume and then you go and you plug your IEMs in and it's got full power going to it, you could very quickly do yourself some damage in your hearing as well as damage your IEMs potentially. So I love the fact that they've designed dedicated outputs for the devices that are going to be plugged into them. Keep in mind, if you do have a pair of headphones that have a 3.5mm termination, you're probably better off adapting them into the 6.3mm rather than going directly into the IEM output. You're probably not going to get enough power in most cases unless they're incredibly sensitive and efficient headphones. In terms of sound quality from the amplifier, as I said, it matches up really nicely with something like the 789, and what that means is it's very neutral, it's very clean, but it doesn't really bring any soul or rhythm or drive to the music. It's just reproducing exactly what the DAC's giving you. And I think that's exactly right for a product like this. I think it would be a mistake if you had a coloured amplifier as a built-in unit, because you're then really locked into certain headphones that are going to work or not work, and you can't change out that amp. By keeping it really neutral, you're not going to have any of what I call negative synergies, where you get, say, a warm headphone with a warm amplifier and you end up with a bucket of mud for your music. Instead, this is going to keep everything clean and let you hear exactly what the headphone is intended to produce in terms of its frequency response. The beauty of the ADI-2 is if you want coloration, if you want something, say, more analog like the Auralic Taurus Mark II, for instance, that I've got here, then you can just run the line outs of this, be it XLR or RCA, into your separate headphone amplifier, and you've got your coloration. You can then also come back to this, and knowing that it is very neutral and it is very clean, you can hear exactly what the music is intended to sound like in terms of the way the DAC is directly decoding it by hearing what's coming off the 6.3 or 3.5mm outputs. In terms of Soundstage presentation, I found that the Soundstage from the amplifier section is basically on par with the DAC, and that tells me that it's not reducing or limiting the DAC output in any way. Again, it's just faithfully reproducing what the DAC's doing. And again, I think that's perfect. So for me, there's really no flaw I can find with the ADI-2 once you get past the initial frustrations, or overwhelm perhaps I should say, of that menu system. Once you get used to that, it's just a joy to use and a joy to own, and I totally understand why so many people love this product. It's something that if I had the spare cash, I'd probably actually buy it to keep in my testing rig as my go-to testing DAC and even mid-range headphone amplifier. So all in all, to summarize this, the ADI-2 is an absolute beast of a unit. For something so incredibly small and compact, relatively light but not in a cheap way, it does feel like it's quality manufacturing. But for something so relatively small, it just does so much. It's a top level DAC in its price point in terms of being able to change filters and the various settings that you might need, whether it's through the variable line outs on the back or the headphone jack outputs on the front. It just does everything, and it does it really, really cleanly. Like I said, it loses by just a hair to the Chord Qutest in terms of overall sound quality. But I have to say, as an all-in-one unit, it in some ways is better value than the Qutest because it just does so much. And if you weren't having the two side by side to A/B compare them, I don't think you would ever miss the subtleties of the Qutest. You'd just thoroughly enjoy the sound coming out of the ADI-2. There's really nothing it doesn't do, and there's also nothing it doesn't do really well. And that's a great statement for a product like this that is an all-in-one powerhouse. You want it to not have any shortcomings, and it really doesn't. The amplifier, sure, is not a $2,000 level amplifier, but I think the amplifier is a secondary part of this puzzle, and it's absolutely up to the task where you wouldn't feel like you had to immediately add an external amplifier. There's other products on the market like this that I've tried over the years where the amplifier really holds back the overall system and you feel like you have to buy an extra amplifier. At that point, you've got to question, well, why did I pay for the built-in amplifier in the first place? Could they have made it $400 or $500 cheaper and just given me a great DAC? In the case of the ADI-2, that kind of logic doesn't come into it because the amplifier is absolutely up to the task until you get into a really high level tier amplifier up into the $1,000 plus level where you're starting to hear the differences that this can't keep up with. So thank you again for all of the commenters that have told me about the ADI-2, that have asked for me to compare it to the Q-Test. It's been a great product to play with. I'm really going to miss it when it's gone, and I would absolutely love to have it back in my collection one day if circumstances allowed it. It's that good. While I'm saying thanks, I must say thank you again to Innovative Music Australia for making this review possible and sending me the loan unit. And I'll place some information down below so that if you're in Australia, you can find the retailers here that do stock the RME ADI-2. For those overseas, I'll put an Amazon link there. As always, if you did choose to purchase through that link, it's a huge support for the channel, and thank you very much for those that do that. Last and not least, I should remind you again of the Moondrop SSR giveaway. Don't forget to drop a comment and subscribe so you can get yourself in that draw for a great pair of free IEMs. For now though, I'll say happy listening, keep an eye out for the ADI-2 Q-Test video, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.